We believe life can be a journey toward wholeness, toward reconnecting with who we are authentically meant to be. We walk this path of growth and discovery with our children, with our partners, within ourselves. These are the stories of what's possible. These are the conversations that light the way. Welcome to Soul Path Parenting. Hello, everyone. This is Amy Breeze Cooper. Thank you so much for joining us for episode 62 and our next installment in the Reimagining Education series. So here's something I learned from our guest. Teachers teach a subject. They teach curriculum. Educators educate students. They educate other humans. Why is this important? Because as we reimagine what's possible in education, it's fascinating to realize what would be possible if we actually put learners rather than curriculum at the center. This is just one of the ideas that our inspiring guest today is going to share with us. Miguel Gonzalez is director of a micro school here in Denver, Colorado, a middle school, in fact, that is learner-centered and embedded into a coffee shop and a bike shop. Pretty cool, right? I know I would have loved to go there as an 11-year-old. Lauren and I just loved our conversation with Miguel. He's also going to talk about the power of radical trust. Oh my gosh, imagine what would be possible if we had radical trust in our educators and our students. He's going to talk about the power of everyone in a school learning, not just the students, and how little schools like his might just be the trim tab that can eventually turn the big ship of education. So let's dive into the conversation. Hello, Miguel, and thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
We're excited to learn from you. And I would love to just start by asking you to tell us your story. How did you become involved with Embark, and how did Embark come to be?
Yeah, those feel like big questions, Amy.
Yeah.
Yeah, so um, I can start with my journey, and I would say, like I was born and raised in Colorado, and I grew up in a predominantly white community. So being, a person of color in a white community certainly started my trajectory and recognizing that things didn't always align, especially in education settings. Um, and while I had a positive experience growing up, it definitely created this dissonance in my head that there was something different and something a different way to go about things. And my journey, um, both personally and professionally, led me into working with youth, and I knew from an early age I wanted to really work with students and youth. One of my first jobs was like working at like before and after care for the YMCA. And like
Mm-hmm.
really like supporting students in like the simple things in life, and seeing them like light up, like that was really really impactful for me. And so that kind of set me on a path, going into college, and getting my teaching credentials, and just really starting my education in middle school, in teaching in a middle school as an English teacher. It was a traditional middle school in Colorado Springs, and even right out of the gate, that dissonance, that disruption in my head continued to kind of niggle at it, and I was always the teacher who was trying to do something just slightly different than everybody else. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and at that point in my career, I couldn't quite make sense of it other than it like I knew this was right for the students in front of me. Um, but I still was like really, I was really young and maturing in my career and was fighting a little bit of like, well, there's the master teachers and this is the way it was supposed to be doing, like be done. Um, and then like how could I find the cracks in the system to do what I felt was right and what the feedback I was receiving from my students were right. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and moving from that place, like, also being young in my career, there was a part where I was like, oh yeah, okay, like I'm ready. I'm ready to do something different. Whether I really was or wasn't, I don't know, but that's the way life works. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
um, I, ended up moving to an international school in Costa Rica. And moving to an international school in Costa Rica was really impactful because what it did is it took me from a big public school in the United States to a small international school with a small community. Um, as an American international school, it's like, American school, like a US school placed in a foreign country. So our students received like the US diploma. Um, and so it was, very similar. There was lots of similarities, but then obviously you're in a new culture, um, and working in a smaller community. And that really was transformative because it started to help me make sense of what was happening early in my career. I was able to like really build relationships with my students because it was smaller. I was able to understand like who they are, like understand and learn about their families and their siblings and their paths. And the school that I was at was made up of a third of our students were from the United States, a third were from Costa Rica, and a third were from around the rest of the world. And so it was really important to get to know those students and their journeys because they were entering the classrooms with their own stories, their own histories. Um, and so you couldn't just deliver a lesson, right? You had to understand who these people were for them to make sense of any sort of learning. Um, and so once I started to make sense of that, that was super impactful on the journey. And while I was in Costa Rica, that was also when I started my leadership journey. And so I moved from the classroom. I eventually became the high school principal, um, and started to both still really work with students, but also helping adults make sense of this. Um, Coming back from Costa Rica, after being there for 5 years, I moved into Denver Public Schools as in a kind of a central office position, helping coach emerging leaders. And that was powerful in the sense that it was the exact opposite of what I was coming from. And
Mm.
in a way, it really sealed the learning that I think I needed to have, which is that I don't like work well in a system that large. Um, I felt lost. I felt like a cog in the wheel. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and while I think DPS does amazing things for what it's doing and how big it is, I just recognized that it wasn't the space for me to make an impact in education and what I felt like I could offer. So after after a year there, I started a journey of like, okay, well, what does this look like in the United States? I knew that I needed a small community. I knew that's where I was going to be able to thrive and can contribute to students and families. And so that led me to being the middle school director of a Montessori school down in Douglas County. And all of a sudden now you can kind of start to see like certain elements are starting to align because now I knew community, I knew there's this disruption, and all of a sudden I was placed in a community that really valued um, learner centered or like education, right, through the Montessori
Mm-hmm.
pedagogy. And it started to really make a lot of sense, um, putting these three things together, that education can and should be done different uh, for students. And I really loved my time there, but um, I'm not a trained Montessorian. I think Montessori has a lot of power, and is a pedagogy that's really impactful, and a lot of students learn from it. Um, and I recognize that, like, in that, I really recognize that, like, pedagogies have believers, and that not being a trained Montessorian set me a little bit outside of the group. And I started to
Mm-hmm.
question, like, well, there can't just be like one pedagogy that's right for everyone, right? Different
Yeah.
students learn in different ways. That's what I've learned from getting to know my learners. That's what I've learned from getting to know my communities. And while Montessori is, really great and probably the right thing for a lot of learners, it can't be right for everybody. So I ended up really fortuitously meeting the executive director of a nonprofit called Great Work Inc., who actually does traditionally or had traditionally worked in the Montessori world. And the executive director, Brian Sintz, was really trying to explore this idea of opening a school um, embedded in a coffee shop and a bike shop, a micro school, and really also valued all of those things, right? Having small community, being able to value and recognize each learner as their own person, and um, well, pulling from the best practices of different pedagogies, whether that be Montessori or project-based learning or expeditionary, or Reggio or any of them. They're all fantastic, but they're all, in my view, a means to an end. Um, and so when I connected with Brian, the idea, it was just an idea. Embark was an idea. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so, together, he had already started, in partnership with some other schools, started Pinwheel Coffee, which is one of our two small businesses that Embark is embedded in. But Embark was just an idea of like, how do we bring students and communities together? And so together, together, we started that with a team of founding educators and really breathed life into this school, Embark Education, which is its design pillars are being embedded, integrated, and learner centered. Um, Embedded in our businesses, bringing like the curriculum across and not siloed into English and humanities and science and math, but rather grounding in the competencies like critical thinking, quantitative reasoning, um, and more like, meaningful pieces. And then learner centered, which is really that piece of like understanding our learners, who they are. And if we get to know them, we will make different educational decisions because we know who they are. And then finally, like not being grounded in a specific pedagogy. Um, because if we find ourselves defending the pedagogy versus defending the learning that's right for our students, then we're probably in the wrong conversations.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Wow, there's a dozen questions that are springing to mind. And also, I've had the opportunity to speak with Miguel before. I know, Lauren, this is your first time meeting Miguel, and you also share a background of having taught in traditional school, in high school, actually, as well as having taught in Montessori. So I'm sure you're bubbling over with questions as well. I'm gonna let you ask the first question.
You know me, Amy. You know
Oh
me.
yeah, I do.
Miguel, I'm so excited to hear your story.
Yes, thank
I
you.
taught high school English. I think it's us English teachers that are the rebels, in my opinion.
It might be.
Yeah. And no shade to all the other subject teachers, but my English teacher people tend to be the ones who question things to this radical root level that I feel like you have so beautifully done. And I was a traditional high school English teacher. I dabbled in Montessori. I came to the same conclusion as you. So my journey included thinking Montessori was the answer, temporarily becoming a believer and a follower of Montessori, and then questioning that and observing and becoming skeptical and seeing how in the Montessori school that I taught in, it wasn't serving every child equally in that environment. That was my experience, which I think connects with your conclusion that even if this is right for a lot of people, there's no one pedagogy that's right for everyone. And how do we discern what is right for someone? We need to know who they are.
Hmm.
And so that is just so beautiful. I love the concept of your micro school. I love the premises that it's built on, the embedded, integrated, learner-centered, get to know who the students are. How can we serve them if we don't know who they are? So all that to say, as you move forward in this field and with what you're doing now, yeah, it's hard to pick a question because in my experience, it can still, even once coming to those conclusions, I still struggle with what I'm still a believer of and not a believer of. I'm more aware of that now. So as you've co-created and developed this opportunity for students to be interacting with their community through a bike shop and a coffee shop, which I think is incredible and meaningful, and connecting in ways that isolating factory model schools and even Montessori schools and other alternative education schools can still be isolating, not plugged into their communities. As you move forward with this, how are you balancing doing what you think is best with also continuing to support diversity and not becoming a believer and an advocate of your new idea, which I think is what happens with the other pedagogies. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. That's such a good question. And actually, I think there's a couple of pieces to that, Lauren. I think, it is continuing to learn every day in what we're doing, right? Like being embedded in these two businesses has been probably one of the most challenging learning experiences I've ever had. And I think that might also be true for the educators who we work with. And recognizing that, like, on the surface, the school being in a bike shop and a coffee shop and all the obviously like wonderful learning opportunities that are there are actually really hard to match up, right? Because the speed of business and the speed of learning are two different things, right? The decisions that need to be made in the moment on the business front can be really ripe learnings for students, but putting those together and overlapping into something meaningful on both sides doesn't necessarily match. So what that has done for us, Lauren, is it's essentially continued to keep us in like off balance, right? We have to approach every day and every week as learners because nobody else has done this, at least not. I mean, if you guys happen to find a school who's done it like in the same way we have, like please tell me, because we don't know.
I literally searched because I'm in Indiana and my daughter is turning 14 and I was like, do I have one of those here? And the answer was no. So go ahead.
Yeah, so like it's really put us into this place of true learning, right? Where we have to ask ourselves critical questions. We have to ask it of ourselves. We have to ask it of our community. We have to ask it of our learners. And then it's not just any one of our answers that is the right answer. Because actually, like, as I'm even saying that, like, there's not a right answer. There's just an answer. And then, so that's been, like, I would say that's been really, really important for us not to like settle into this being like a specific piece, right? But then the other side of it is really thinking about, I was just right before our call today talking with some other leaders around like integral theory and like consciousness mindset shifts. And I've talked with you a little bit about this
our
as
language.
well.
Yes.
And what does that look like as educators, right? And how do we both progress through different levels of thought and consciousness as well as regress? And when do we do those things and why do we do those things? And how does that map up against like a learner-centered paradigm? The learner-centered paradigms are fairly well established, through the pedagogies and then also through the amazing work of organizations like Redesign, Transcend, Education Reimagined. Katie Martin has been doing some amazing work out of Altitude. So the paradigms are feeling pretty solid. That's really been important. But the difference between like understanding the paradigms and knowing them theoretically and then practicing and believing them are different. And so how do we question ourselves around like what we're doing in a daily practice, like through the businesses, and then how does that intersect with our growth as humans, really? And how do we support our learners in doing the same?
I love that. And I want to, if I may, echo back a couple of points that you said that really resonated with me. So part of your answer to Lauren's question is that you're pointing to the learning isn't just happening with students learning in a school. The entire school is learning, and also the individuals are on a path, or you're looking to explore how they're learning and growing their consciousness as humans. So it feels like a model that's both learner-centered, but also that learning is embedded throughout the various dimensions of the school in a way that's really opening my eyes to a new possibility, which is what we're all about talking about in this podcast.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. We've actually, it's, funny enough, we do have, oftentimes live in a theoretical land of that learning, right? And like, what are the, we've oftentimes talked about Embark in like 3 and 4 dimensions of learning. And what are those dimensions? Like the student learning, the adult learning, how we share with the community, how the community shifts, and how the community learns. And like all of those have different threads that tie together, and hopefully ground itself back in our amazing businesses and Embark.
I also wanted to highlight, and for me, this was actually a big aha in this conversation, which is crazy now that I think about it. It just shows how indoctrinated I was by traditional education. But I think it's really revolutionary, this idea that you actually have to get to know the students.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Like that's the one of the biggest challenges of traditional education. That's actually what we are taught as educators, and through many teacher preparation programs and administrative programs, is it's actually not about the learners. It's about the curriculum. It's about the data. It's about the grades. About the textbooks or whatever it may be. It's about pretty much anything other than the human in front of you. And we've definitely come to realize that like when you really, really know them, you can't use the same, dipping back into being an English teacher. Like you can't just use the same short stories year after year, because that's what the curriculum says to do. If you are looking at this human and recognize like, oh, that's going to trigger some of their trauma that they have. Mm-hmm. And then that's going to shut them down for the day, the week, who knows, right? Or, there's this really, like they're really passionate about, a certain topic. And like, you can make the choice to pull upon something that's going to tap into those passions further. And then even more than that is, in Embark's context, it's like, how do you make that, like, it's more than short stories. It's more than those topics, but like, what are the experiences that are truly relevant, that aren't fabricated, that don't end with a presentation to the teacher and to the class. Mm-hmm. How do you make decisions that you're seeing this person in front of you and you're able to help them contribute to a meaningful goal and outcome? That's where our shops have provided us this real world context that is truly unique, and in ways that gives them something that they're grounding in. They see it being meaningful. Like we had students design seasonal drinks for Pinwheel Coffee, and through their seasonal drinks, they got to see them put on the menus, which is super meaningful. They also got to see and track the sales. And what does that do for the business? And, not every student had that. And I think it was just as impactful for the students, if not more impactful for the students who didn't get their drinks chosen, to be able to reflect upon why not? Where did collaboration go astray? Where did, our data collection or quantitative reasoning not align with others? And like, there's as much powerful learnings in those pieces. That's not about the curriculum, not about, the textbook that we're using, but really is rooted back into getting to know our students.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so much value there. And I'm thinking back to my traditional teaching experience and to being handed a curriculum and then given the task of lesson planning and trying to personalize and individualize it for people I hadn't met yet. And then meeting those people and then trying to bridge that gap. And that, what it's bringing up for me, and I think you speak to this, Miguel, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that. It's bringing up trust, because if we are giving our teachers a curriculum that we expect them to put into the children's heads, because we don't trust the teacher to meet the students where they are and then to figure out how to collectively, collaboratively move towards the goals that we are supposed to be equipped to help individuals move towards. So how does trust factor into what you do?
Oh man. Yes. So we talk about it in the sense of radical trust, Lauren. It's a phrase that we use often. Is what is it, and ask ourselves, what does it look like to radically trust each other? And I think that you're definitely, you're correct. Like trusting the professionals, trusting teachers, or at Embark, we don't use the word teachers. We call them educators. I think they're different. Teaching and educating are two different things. But radically trusting the educators to be like full professionals, full experts, bring their full body of knowledge to bear for our students. And where they don't know answers, that's okay. Where they, to be able to be vulnerable and humble, and the fact that like we're in this journey together, and trusting that that's going to be okay. Trusting that you don't have to have the answers to everything. But then I think the other piece that is we push into a lot at Embark is, what does it mean to radically trust our learners, right? Because that's where also where education goes awry, is like we don't trust youth, right? We build schedules, we build boxes, we control their time. We do all of those things because we don't trust them. And so, where Embark has been exploring is like, what does it look like actually where you start the trust with the students, then the trust with the educators, and then trust with, with me, with the shops, with our communities, with parents, and it goes upwards versus downwards. And really starting with what does it look like to trust students to, to make drinks that are going to be sold in professional shops, to work alongside professional baristas and professional bike mechanics. And yeah, so I think trust is a huge piece. And also trust is delicate, right? It can get broken really easy. And so it's also thinking about how do you build the culture that can withstand breaches of trust. And, what are the scaffolded supports that we can put in place where like that's not a punitive thing, but rather like a learning experience? Or what scaffolds does that person need to continue to be efficacious in their learning, versus it being like, oh, well, you didn't do that right, so now you have this consequence. But rather like, hey, if we're talking about time, trust is time. Our students build their schedules every week here at Embark, and so we don't necessarily dictate exactly when they need to read or when they need to do certain things. They're able to build elements of their own time and owning that piece. And certain students won't always follow through with those things. And so instead of it, again, being punitive, it's like, well, what does it look like to work with an educator to have more structured supports for that? And that's what they need right now. That's not a bad thing. It's just what they need developmentally right now. And then again, working towards those elements of autonomy and of agency. So, yeah.
I love that so much, because children learn how to make decisions for themselves by making decisions for themselves. They don't learn how to build a schedule and follow through on it by being given a schedule and forced to comply with it. They learn by building a schedule, following through or not, having educators around, witnessing, observing, reflecting back to the student what happened, and being willing to ask in a growth-oriented way, let's look at why that happened. Let's look at how that happened. What would we experiment with next week? And I'm thinking about myself, and I like to sometimes fancy myself a professional adult at this point in my life. And I create schedules for myself, and I don't always follow through perfectly on them still.
Right.
And I have survived this long. So I think about reassessing what we reasonably expect from middle school students in the present moment and reflecting accurately on what we are embodying as their guides and mentors and, supposed adults. So I think all of that has so much value. Yeah, so much value there. And having a repair process rather than a punitive punishment system that ends up in a place where we don't really want to go.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think a lot of what you're pointing to here, in order to have trust and really let radical trust come to the fore, we have to loosen control. Yep. And there's this massive system that wants to have control more than anything. Mm-hmm. I would love that's just my viewpoint as a parent and a student who went through it. I'd love to take the conversation in the direction of how some of what you're learning, what the implications are broadly for the system. And before we go into any specifics, you have a beautiful analogy. I think you know the one I'm referring to, that I would love for you to share with Lauren and our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we love Embark. And I think, there's a lot of pieces of Embark that are incredibly powerful and are really, really elements for people to learn from. But Embark is a micro school. And it is not, we did not build it to be scaled, nor necessarily replicated, right? We actually fundamentally do not think that people should come to Embark, learn from Embark, and try to build their own Embarks elsewhere, right? But rather learning from our practice and learning from the different pieces of what does it look like to radically trust students, and how can we do that in our own context. And so the metaphor that we use to really embody that is the metaphor of a trim tab, which comes from Buckminster Fuller. And what the metaphor is on big shipping vessels and big ocean liners, the ship is so large that the rudder cannot turn the ship on its own. There must be a smaller rudder right at the base that must turn first. And that smaller rudder is called the trim tab. And so every day we show up at Embark trying to embody the spirit of being a trim tab, because if we're able to turn, then maybe we can turn the rudder, which hopefully will turn the bigger ship that represents education as a whole. But we know that we can't do it alone. We know that we're, our best piece of service to the educational community is to be a proof point, to be something different, to be a beacon of what can be possible. So that way they can learn and make their shifts in their communities.
I love that so much, because I was completely guilty at first of we need 1 million Embarks. That will save the world. That will fix everything, because that's me still embodying the traditional model of education that doesn't work, which is this replicate, repeat, require kind of model. Find something that works somewhere. Everything that was handed to me might have worked somewhere in some moment with some group of humans, but it didn't work for me. It didn't work for my students, because we didn't create it from who we were, who we are. And so as I'm learning from you in this conversation, I'm learning, if someone is drawn to Embark and loves what you're doing, can you share your process of deciding on a coffee shop and a bike shop? What was that process like for you and the people who participated in that? Because if I wanted to create the little mini rudder, what was it called?
The trim tab.
Okay, so let's say I'm in Indiana, you're in Colorado. I'm like, I love this idea. I want to create a trim tap in Indiana that's going to maybe help turn this rudder that'll turn the giant ship that's education. What would you offer me? Because you're not going to tell me to copy and repeat what you've created, because that's based on your community. But what would you offer me in terms of insight into the process I might try to begin to do something that would actually be organic and authentic for where I am?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that there's a couple of different ways to answer that, Lauren. I think, my first question would really be around like, what is right for your community,
Mm-hmm.
right? You had really beautifully articulated that, the models of, something works, so you just replicate, copy, and repeat it. Um, I don't necessarily believe that's the right way to go about doing it because, back to my opening piece around me being a person of color in a predominantly white community, like what I
Mm-hmm.
needed was something different,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's these disruptions that we recognize and we need something different. And so what's right for Embark may not necessarily be right for you in Indiana. You have completely different people. You guys have different value sets. You have um, different pieces in smaller towns, bigger towns, urban settings. All of those have different hallmarks to what's really meaningful to the people there. And
Mm-hmm.
so really grounding and rooting in those spaces is where I'd first open exploration on a big scale, right? Those are big questions that are
Mm-hmm.
sometimes hard to answer. But if I was going to take something a little bit smaller, right? How do you take some of this learner-centered mindset and be a trim tab in your own spaces with youth and learners? One of the most powerful things that I have used as practice is actually comes from an article from Jim Rickbaugh. And he actually has three learner-centered questions that have really resonated with me. Um, the three questions to explore are: what am I doing that my learners could do? What am I doing that my learners should do? And what else can my learners do that will build their learning and increase their capacity to learn?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And if you're able to like bring those three questions to, smaller tasks, smaller spaces, and then extrapolate that into like, if we took that and answered that question just as you were founding a school, founding a learning environment, or even bringing together and gathering people, um, that can really put the learners at the center, be a trim tab, and you can see it grow from there.
Mm-hmm. Thank
I
you.
also love that concept for parents. I'm going to take that on. What am I doing that my children could do or should do? It's just interesting how, and we've talked about this too, Lauren, as a part of Reimagining Education in this series, one of the things we've talked about is that education doesn't just happen in schools. It also happens at home. And we have an episode around the fact that the parent is the first teacher. So I'm going to borrow that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, just to build on Lauren's question, I had a related question. Her question centered more on the process and where do we begin. My question focuses more on I think the principles. What would you say? Are there key findings that you have that you feel like could be extrapolated and embedded into other environments? Even, I'm curious, I guess let me rephrase that, or let me restate the question, because what's gnawing at me is this. We have this big ship like you've talked about. And I'm seeing in the context of this conversation the most obvious thing that I never saw before, which is, oh my gosh, the educators have to know the students as humans. It starts there. It's not just, as Lauren said, something that you develop your curriculum and your lesson plan and everything, and then all of a sudden you've got these humans in front of you, and now you're trying to have one thing meet the other thing. And so if we were to really embrace that insight of knowing the learners firstly, what are the implications for the system that we have? How does the system that we have relate to that? Can it respond to that? Does it get torn to the ground? What do we do about that understanding in the context of what we have today?
Yeah, I think it's disruptive.
Yeah, it's disrupting me in a really good way.
Cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, it's really disruptive. Because when you do that, right, it changes the conversations around like the things that we have valued in traditional education, right? The outcome could be completely different. The outcome of traditional education built on a factory model is, people who can follow instructions, people who can complete tasks, um, and that kind of ilk. But in a learner-centered way, like your outcomes are like people who can ask questions, people who can critically think, people who can assess problems, and work towards solutions. Those are fundamentally different pieces for our society, right?
Yeah.
And then like if you take that back down into the education system on its own, it's like you have to rethink like, well, what is assessment? What is like, how do you assess that? How do you credential that? What does that look like in communities? Um, and you have to rethink a lot of the fundamental pieces that we know as schooling and start thinking about it as learning. And that is, again, like that's the difference between teacher and educator, schooling and learning. And all of a sudden you're creating these tension points, that we valued in society, right? Like what happens when, and we're seeing it play out in certain spaces, right? Like we're seeing COVID's, you know well, as tragic as it has been, it's also been very disruptive in the educational spheres. Like all of a sudden SATs, ACTs were no longer these measures to, get into colleges and universities. And all of a sudden, this data point, this like these tests, these areas of assessment were no longer valid. And so we had to rethink, how do we support learners in taking next steps, and relook at like those different fundamental pieces. And so we're starting to see this disruption play out in different spaces, but there's so many spaces, um, that are out there that it can be daunting to take on all at once. Um, and there are, again, some fantastic organizations who are trying to break these pieces down into chunks to make them manageable for everybody to dig into. Two of them that come to mind are Transcend and Education Reimagined, um, who are really like pulling together educators from across the country to hold these conversations. So like, what does it look like when we do this, and how does that affect assessment and credentialing, um, without having an answer? So.
Yeah. Um, I'd love to shift gears a little bit, and if this is okay with you, Lauren. If not, steer me in a different direction. But I'm curious about middle school and humans at this age where they're really, there's this, and Lauren and I have talked about, there's this almost missing rite of passage in our culture, but that is that pivotal age when they're going from childhood into early adulthood. They're shifting into,
Mhm.
yeah. And I'm curious, based on your experience as a middle school teacher, you started there, you've continued there. What is it that kids really need, potentially, that they're not getting in the bigger system that we have today? But what do you see as humans and as learners? I guess firstly, as humans, what do they need at that life stage?
Yeah, to be seen, right? Like, to be seen is by far the most important piece. To be valued, right? Like that transition, middle school has been like demonized in the United States. It is,
Yeah.
you know, like the horror stories that people like, you ask any adult, like, how was middle school? And they shudder, right? And it's
Yeah.
because it is this tumultuous time in development. It is this place where they're seeking identity, they're trying on different personalities, they're testing boundaries. All of these things are 100% developmentally appropriate, and, are not always in control of the learner. It's like the brain developing, it's the chemicals firing, it is all of those things, and they can't control it. But because of our sense of control, which we were talking about earlier in the conversation, we have, they don't fit in the sense of control. They don't fit into the boxes we want them to fit into. And so when you try to do that, you create negative experiences, which over time in the United States has created this narrative of middle school being this horrific time of like not being accepted, of tumultuous friendships, and um, all of these negative things or puberty and like all of the
Mhm.
pieces. It's like as you're going through those things, it's like it's hard, it's new, but your concepts are changing, and you're trying to seeking a sense of acceptance, um, and seeking a community in which you fit into. And so it is this missing time. It is this time that the humans are wanting to be seen and be given the space to safely do those things without judgment, without consequence. Not that they don't make bad decisions and there shouldn't be consequences, right? There's consequences to decisions, but like the natural consequences that occur, and the feedback that is given from their peers, and from society versus constructed, um, confines to be put in. So it is definitely a forgotten time, and also like middle school. Why middle school? Why embark at middle school? Like if one of it is, if you look across the education ecosystem, there are elementary schools, especially innovative elementary schools, and pretty innovative high schools. And then you find spaces that are K-8 or 6 through 12, but nobody spends the time to specialize in this space, right?
Yeah.
K5 or K8s oftentimes just tack middle school onto the end of an elementary school experience, or 612s, they just tack it onto the beginning, and they treat them as high schoolers or they treat them as glorified elementary school students versus like you have unique needs in your development.
Yeah. What that raises for me is a question. The question being, how, is it possible, because we love talking about what's possible on this podcast, is it possible to have a really large organization, whether it's a high school with 5,000? There's a high school in Indiana with 10,000 students. That's
Oh,
huge for high school, in my opinion. And yet a college with 20 or 40,000 students doesn't concern me in the same way as a 10,000 student high school. And some of the questions that are arising for me to explore, and I have no answers, are the questions around, is it possible to create a very large organization that is built on practices that allow for the co-creation of meaningful relationships between smaller groups of people? Because part of what I was hearing in what you were naming, Amy, is, if I went to a high school with 10,000 students, it's humanly impossible for me to have a meaningful, intimate relationship with everyone in that building. It's just too many people for that to happen. But is it a mistake to conclude that therefore meaningful, intimate relationships can't happen there and they can only happen in a micro school? Or, are there ways to co-create that to the varying degrees? Because whatever the scientific supposed limit for meaningful relationships is, which is supposedly in the hundreds, like Amy was talking about, can we co-create environments that support those regardless of the number of people in them?
Thank you for so much more clearly articulating what I was pondering.
Well, we love to nuance each other. So, Miguel,
Yeah.
do you have any questions or thoughts or nuances you want to add to take us farther in this conversation?
yeah. I mean, I think, I definitely agree with the wondering, and I think, from my perspective, the answer is that, or my thoughts are that like it is possible. Why universities and not high schools, right? I'd actually challenge that like universities are broken into smaller colleges.
Mm-hmm.
They're broken into smaller communities with a sense of an identity. And so, when we send from Embark, we send students on to like some of the big comprehensive high schools. I talk with students and I talk with families about finding your community within it, because that's one of the pieces that we know. Like, research has been well documented around like why students disengage, and it's when they don't have a sense of connection is like a fundamental factor in that. And so you have to be able to have the smaller communities within a bigger system, um, to be able to create a sense of connection. The other piece I wonder around with with this idea is like accountability, right? Like where does the accountability lie? if the accountability lies with the bigger system versus the smaller system, then how does that fundamentally change the relationships that can form? I don't know the answer to that one.
Yes, I love your question because it's making me think of the difference between from the ground up and from the top down, right? And so if we're working from the ground up and we have enough support and resources and awareness, we can probably facilitate an organization or a community that could ultimately be very large, but we've worked from the ground up. We put the effort in to know the people that we're serving and to keep changing and learning alongside them. And, it could be that could happen on every level if it's going from the ground up and it's continuing to be supported and valued by every level. If we're going from the top down, because in the traditional high school setting, if you have 10,000 students and the superintendent who doesn't even visit that building is putting down things that then are given to the principal, given to the teachers, given to all the students, there's such a huge disconnect there. And that's when we run into, the majority of students falling through the cracks of a system like that. But that system wasn't designed to serve them in a healthy way in the first place anyway. And so, because I think of the concerns teachers have about children falling through the cracks, right? So if we were to, take what's universalizable from Embark and say, even in a high school with 10,000 students, if there's one adult to every 10 kids and that adult's role is to know those 10 kids and know how they're doing and then report to whoever needs to be reported to and make changes and help support. And because, I taught high school, I had 25 to 30 students per class. I taught 6 periods. There was one year when my classes were slightly overloaded. I think I had 175 students. I saw 175 students for 55 minutes each day, every day of the week. Was I able to know them all? No, I was not, and so, did I try my best? Was I a young teacher doing what I was told and trying to differentiate instruction and make it meaningful, but also follow the curriculum and, do what felt like the impossible until I got burnt out and quit? Sure. Yeah, that happened. But, had I been assigned 10 students who I knew one of my primary jobs was to know them and know if they were being supported well, that's a whole different story, no matter how big the system is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I
definitely
agree with that. That's a beautiful dream. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just definitely agree with that. And, in that scenario, Lauren, which I totally resonates with me. And it definitely calls me back to that piece of like, where are you held accountable? You're held accountable to actually meaningful relationships versus being held accountable pushing students through a curriculum, right? When you're trying to scale things on economies of scale and you're just trying to push students through a factory model system, having 175 students that's possible. If the check mark at the end is like you did it, then you've done it, right? Versus having this accountability, both internal and external, to building relationships and seeing your students. Again, that's that fundamental shift that we would see in a disruptive manner. Mm-hmm. And what would that do? What would that do to a whole high school? You'd have to change the schedules. You'd have to change staffing structures. You'd have to change a lot of things. And change is terrifying for systems who are doing exactly what they've set out to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Which is why I've come to realize in the series of conversations that we're not talking about reforming the education system that we have. We're talking about forming education possibilities that don't exist yet. There's no tweaking around the edges that's going to make what we have work.
Well, and I just love your concept of radical trust and the concept of radical questioning. I was recently told that the root of radical, the etymology of radical is root, to get to the root of something. So a radical question questions the root of it. And when we have these massive systems full of people who I imagine feel like, cogs in the machine, that's how I ended up feeling. And when people question the root of it, the origin of it, the purpose of it, to question that authentically, you have to risk needing to change it completely, needing to start over, admitting that this, if it ever served, it doesn't anymore. And and then you begin the difficult work of, where do we go from here? How do we go there from here? What are the next steps that we take? And there's so much resistance to that. And I mean, Amy and I think, could speak to, our experiences with resistance in terms of personal transformation even. And Miguel, I see you smiling, so it sounds like you know exactly what I'm talking about. Even as individual humans, the willingness to question, my personal transformation journey has included radically questioning how I was raised, how I was educated, what I was offered, whether it served me, whether it matched me or not, and a returning home to being willing to prioritize my personal truth and my personal experience over conformity for the sake of safety.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's true for individual humans. It's true for the whole system. It's true for change in general.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that. And one of the things, I had a colleague say it the other day is, it feels like right now in education and in our world, this might be the first time that parents making the choice to send students to the exact same thing that they did is not actually serving them, right? The means of change is like, well, education is the change agent in our society. Learning and growing is the change agent. And for most of our time in the history of the United States, like, it was like, well, I did it, so that's the right thing to do. And that actually did serve, right? That did create outcomes that improved our society. But we might be in this first place where parents making that same decision might be the more risky decision than sending them to something new, to moving into that place of change. And I think that is really scary, both on the educator front and certainly on the parenting front.
I love that you're pointing to that. And I'd love to close out with, what thoughts do you have for parents who are wrestling with the educational choices that are in front of them for their children? And perhaps we have listeners who don't even have the kinds of choices that we have here in the Denver metro area, and they have kids in a traditional school setting because that's literally what there is. What would you say to them?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I think it really is, Amy, you pointed to it beautifully earlier. Is like, what are the three questions? Like getting, the three learner-centered questions to help with change. But we've talked a lot about the relationships that are formed between teachers or educators and students and community. But I've also encountered far too many parents who don't know their own children.
Yeah.
They think they do, or they hope they do. And moving beyond that into, they truly do know their student, because I think that will guide the decisions. And then again, like like all of these things transcend, and then trusting their student to be a part of the choice process, to be a part of the discovery of the learning environment that they're going to spend large swaths of their time during the school year in. And I would encourage them to have that open conversation with them around it. And then from there, it's like helping navigate like where they find those communities. So if they're in a big system, that's okay. Like, those are realities that we face, right? That doesn't mean doom and gloom. But as we were talking about, Lauren, it's like, how do you find and explore the communities that fit them, right? Because each of them are made up of smaller communities underneath. And so how do you try it on for a size, and being okay and willing to move from one to another and try them all, right? Um, versus just saying like this one's good enough and settling. So
Yeah, I love
yeah,
that. Thank you so much for sharing your experience and your wisdom on the show today. This was really eye-opening.
yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I love thinking about, the bigger change, the bigger system, and then certainly love sharing, sharing about Embark and my wonderful community. So thank you so much, and I wish you both the best.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did. We hope that your school years, for those of you who have kiddos either already in school or about to go to school, are off to a great start. And we are excited to keep this Reimagining Education series going. We have 2 more episodes teed up in the next few weeks that will really get your wheels turning, I promise. So tune in for those. And if you like what you're hearing here and want to share these powerful ideas and help us spread them, please share this with a friend or take a moment to review the podcast if you're listening on Apple Podcast or wherever you're listening, take a moment to review it. That's how you can help more listeners find this conversation. Until we talk again, be well.